Today is Monday, August 31st, 2020, which means it's time for another episode of Scrolls. Hello, Fiendlings, how the hell are you? It's been, a horrible week since we last spoke. Luna Fiend has been fighting a nasty infection and has pretty much managed to pee on everything in the living room. Fortunately, she's getting better and I might be able to set all my furniture and carpet on fire later this year. Yeah, good luck with that. Even better, the Keko Fiend nearly cracked her skull, and so there was a lot of blood from a head wound and epistaxis, also known as blood and phlegm streaming from the nose. It was a scary night, but Keko was home and doing much better, and my carpet really needs to be burned. Blood and pee, great mix. East Texas and all of Louisiana got hit pretty hard by Hurricane Laura. When they began bringing up power the next day, they purposely caused blackouts around the area to keep the grid intact. As a result, we lost power here for 5 hours, and I'm here to tell you, it got a little toasty in the Fiend Master dungeon. Because I didn't have the latest version of Shipyards on my iPad and couldn't sync because there was no effing power, I picked up an old story that only had an outline and started cranking on that. Amazing how fast the words flowed while I wasn't sitting at my desk, wasn't comfortable, and was pretty much hating life. Go figure. Apart from that, not much to report. Life continues moving forward into the crucible of the future. Wow, that sounded great. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 15 of Legends of Garaaga. Scribe Hall had emptied out. Isaac had urged him to quit for the day, but Herodo had begged off with the excuse his visit with Archelon had taken too long. Isaac grinned, pointed toward the Akkadian tablets, and snickered. Herodo blushed as Isaac left the hall. The tablets describing Gujaratine were far more poetic than the old Tupsoro. Triani, as he now called himself, seemed wistful and nostalgic by comparison. Herodo drank in the cuneiform, scratching the Greek equivalent words as best he could. He wondered if Triani would be pleased he was being so meticulous, or if the long-dead scribe would be annoyed. As he translated, he tried to imagine Triani's voice. The man had always been a faceless, blurry image in his mind. Herodo had never seen someone from the Indus. He only knew they were dark-skinned, much like Egyptians. But how they spoke? The sound of their words? How they dressed? In his tablets regarding Akkad, Tupsura had described the city's denizens, their robes and cloaks and jewelry, but he had never described himself. As Triani, he gave great details on the simple clothes that Gujaratine villagers wore, the foods they ate, their worship of the great river, and the seasonal hunts for meat. But still, the man hadn't scratched a symbol pertaining to himself. Herodo pushed aside the last tablet and stared down at the scroll. The Greek words had flowed like water from the stylus. He read the last bit again and felt a chill. It was the legend that held us together, bound us, and made us a people. Those, like me, who thought it a mere story, weakened those chains of community. I have much to answer for. He sighed and looked out the nearest window. A light ocean breeze had started with the night. The sound of the waves was intoxicating, and he yawned. The nearly moonless night made Ptolemy's navy signal fires that much brighter. Out there on the waves, those boats were giving orders to the armies in the city and beyond. In the hall, with the sounds of the ocean so near, it was impossible to hear the clang and crash of sword on shield, the shouts of the fighters, and the screams of the dying. He would hear those when he finally retired to his cell. Herodo returned his eyes to the scroll. There was less than a tablet's worth of space remaining. He sighed as he blew on the ink to ensure it was dry, and then began rolling it back up. As he finished, and the metal ends clinked together, he let out another yawn. Sleep would be wonderful. But first, he had to return the tablets to the storeroom. He tied a ribbon around the scroll, marked its edge with the reference numbers, and then placed it in a bin. The librarians would perform the cataloging in the morning and place it with the other Akkadian translations. The tablets stared at him from the table. Stifling another yawn, Herodo gathered the 3 clay tablets in his arms and walked toward the hall exit. The braziers were lit in the pathway to the storeroom. The narrow passage made him claustrophobic, but he managed to quell the sensation by taking deep breaths and focusing on his feet. Step, step, step. He looked up and found himself at the storeroom entrance. True to his word, the centurion had handled the issue with the grate. Large stones sat on each corner and held it in place. A somewhat less than elegant solution, but it appeared to be strong enough to keep another intrusion from occurring. Whereas the room had been in darkness the night before, it now blazed with light. The braziers had been filled with fresh fuel. Herodo grunted. As per usual, the Romans had overcompensated. Now the room was too bright. The possibility of a stray spark igniting centuries-old papyrus and vellum didn't seem to occur to them. Herodo sighed. He was too tired to deal with it. He'd tell the centurion downstairs and make it his problem. He walked to the shelves along the wall. 3 open spaces where the rest of Traiani's tablets rested. In the light of the braziers, Herodo examined each tablet, made sure they were in order, and then carefully placed them back in the slots. Tablets. More tablets. They stretched to the end of the wall. Herodo began counting. He lost count at 22, and there were many left. Weeks. He had weeks of Traiani's tales left to translate. A scratching sound. Herodo turned to look at the grate. Something was moving beneath it. His skin prickled in fear. He rose from his knees and took a torch from the wall. The scratching sound stopped. Herodo held his breath. The sound returned. On rubbery legs, the young scribe stepped forward toward the grate, torch held down and to his side. The sound continued. As he neared it, fingers appeared through the metal mesh. Herodo let out a cry. The fingers disappeared. From below, he heard someone curse. "Who are you?" Herodo yelled down into the grate. There was no response save the shuffling of cloth on stone. He ran to the far wall and peered out the small opening. The ocean waves crashed against the shore. In the inky, moonless night, there was nothing to see but the white froth of the water and the city lights. "Sir?" Herodo jumped and almost dropped the torch. He turned and stared at the centurion standing in the doorway. The soldier's short sword was drawn. Heart hammering in his chest, Herodo panted. "Sir, I heard yelling." Herodo nodded and turned back to the grate. "Someone is trying to get into the storeroom," Herodo whispered. The centurion walked across the floor, his sandals barely making any sound. The man stood next to him and stared down through the metal. "Are you certain?" "I saw fingers. I think they were trying to push aside the grate." "Your torch, sir." Herodo handed it to him with numb fingers. The centurion knelt on his haunches and lowered the torch to the grate. In the wavering dim light, Herodo could see splinters of wood and a piece of metal. The centurion grunted. "Sir, I think it best you leave the storeroom and return to the dormitory. Tell the centurion downstairs what has happened, and that I will remain here until dawn." The Roman rose and smiled. "We'll keep them out." "But who would try and get in here? And why?" The centurion shrugged. "Perhaps Ptolemy's men are looking for a way into the library. Find a way to ambush us." Herodo shook his head. "Ptolemy and Caesar have agreed the library is out of bounds." "Perhaps," the Roman said, his eyes returning to the grate. "But that doesn't rule out treachery. This is war, scribe. There are no rules in combat, except to win." He clapped Herodo on the back. "Go your way, young man, and do what I've told you." Herodo took in a shuddering breath. The rush of adrenaline and fear was slowly departing. He felt as though he would faint. "Yes, thank you, centurion." The soldier nodded, gave his salute, and then stood still, eyes gazing into the darkness below. His eyes popped open at the sound of steel on steel. Herodo sat up in bed. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he was. It was still dark out, but the horizon glowed with the hint of day. A hoarse shout of pain caught his attention. He turned toward the window in his cell. Many lights burned in the distance. He rose naked from his bed and walked to the window. The lights moved and bounced. The streets were crowded with centurions and Egyptian soldiers. At the sound of a whistle, a group of Romans assembled from the broken lines. The front line planted their shields and created a continuous wall. Other centurions raised their shields to cover their comrades. Egyptian soldiers flooded into view and rushed the phalanx. The soldiers moved their shields aside and stabbed as one. Shouts of pain, screams of dying men, the clang of sword on shield, the whistle of the commander. The sounds mingled together into an incongruous din. Herodotus watched in horror as the phalanx climbed over fallen bodies and stabbed those who still lived. The Egyptian soldiers rushed forward once more, only to fall again before the organized lines of the Roman soldiers. The Egyptians began their retreat and disappeared from sight. The sky filled with arrows as unseen archers loosed their arsenal. Although the building obscured the fleeing combatants, their shrieks of pain were all too audible. The phalanx stopped its forward motion. The shields remained held above and around the rectangle of men. Herodotus let out a shuddering breath. Another whistle. The phalanx broke apart into lines of men. Another hoarse shout, and the centurions rested. "Been at it all night," a quiet voice said from behind him. Herodotus turned. Isaac stood in the doorway, a robe wrapped around him. "All night? You haven't heard them?" "No," Herodotus admitted. Isaac chuckled. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You've been working too hard." In the darkness, it was impossible to make out more than Isaac's glittering eyes. "I guess I have." Herodotus sat on the edge of his bed and rubbed his eyes. "You can't sleep?" Isaac shook his head. "Not with that going on all night. Perhaps I should suggest to Cleotus that he explain to the warring factions they are interrupting the library's studies." Herodotus laughed. "Yeah, I'm sure Ptolemy and Caesar would give their apologies." Isaac stepped into the room, reached for a robe hanging on the wall, and threw it to Herodotus. It landed on his naked legs. "Perhaps you should cover yourself." Herodotus blushed. Of course." He quickly donned the robe and stared at the window. "Is this madness going to end?" "Soon, I expect." Herodotus turned back to face Isaac. "Dawn is breaking." "Yes." "Someone tried to get into the storeroom again last night." Isaac frowned. "From the grate?" Herodotus nodded. "I saw fingers. They were trying to push the grate aside." "Did you—" "A centurion heard me and came to guard the room. As far as I know, he's still there." Isaac nodded. "What could they want in the storeroom? Everything there is to be translated or already has been. All they have to do is ask to see something." Herodotus shrugged. "I don't know. The centurion thought maybe Ptolemy's men were trying to get into the library so they could mount an ambush. Hardly likely. If Ptolemy's men attempted to use the library for military purposes, the outcry would finish him. I guarantee Caesar would use that to rally all of Alexandria against him." "Perhaps," Herodotus said. The sounds of battle started once more. "What if Caesar is trying to make it look like Ptolemy's breaking into the library?" Isaac shook his head. "You hung around Archelon too long yesterday. He's passed on his madness." The young scribe smiled. "He's really quite intelligent." "No doubt, but that doesn't make him less insane." "The maps he showed me were amazing, Isaac, incredibly detailed." "Places are not our job, Herodotus. Words are." "Places belong to words," Herodotus muttered. "What?" "Nothing. Is today the Sabbath?" Isaac nodded. "Scribe Hall in a few hours." Herodotus yawned. "Then I have time for more revision." "Yahweh will not be pleased. There is no work on the Sabbath." "You say that every Sabbath, and I always say the same thing back to you." "I know." Isaac clutched the robe tighter around himself. "You may pursue your passion alone, my friend. I'm going to try and sleep." "Good morning." "Morning," Isaac said, and disappeared from the cell. Herodotus rose and looked out the window. Daylight was encroaching fast. The torches seemed out of place and less bright. By the time the sun rose into the sky, the fighting would more than likely cease altogether. Without Ptolemy's signal fires to guide his troops, the Egyptian army would retreat until nightfall. One day soon, Caesar would have to make a choice. Either die one soldier at a time during the night, or push forward through the streets of Alexandria and chase Ptolemy's army into the desert. The battles in the streets had disrupted the daily lives of the entire city, save the library. Herodotus wondered how much longer the Egyptian citizens would put up with it. Those who hadn't chosen a side would soon be forced to choose Cleopatra or her brother for their ruler. With the sunlight strengthening, he could make out the faces of corpses. He shivered and looked away. Traiani had written of the endless Akkadian wars along their border, but Akkad itself had never been attacked. Traiani would have written an epic account of these small skirmishes, highlighting every detail. Herodotus shrugged off his robe, dressed in a fresh tunic the slave had left for him, and put on his sandals. He wanted to swim, but Cleopas had been firm about not leaving the confines of the library walls. He yawned again and placed the robe on a peg. The slave would clean up his room, as always, and leave a fresh robe and tunic for the next day. He turned and stared at the lamp on a tiny bedside table. Scribe Hall would more than likely be dark this time of the morning. Herodotus took 2 steps toward the lamp and stopped. He smiled. "I'll risk it," he whispered as he left his cell. As expected, Scribe Hall was empty and clothed in shadow. The new day's sunlight barely penetrated the gloom. Most of the braziers as well as the torches had burned out. Herodotus sighed. The servants hadn't yet made their way to the hall to light it for the day's work. "Or the Sabbath services," Herodotus whispered. He walked to the wall, grabbed the bucket of oil, and marched back to the brazier nearest his table. The inky liquid slid into the brazier's reservoir. He was careful not to overfill it. The servants would do a proper job when they returned to prepare the hall. Outside the window, the ocean rolled with high, white, froth-filled waves. The western horizon was dark with clouds. Herodotus frowned and shivered. On the library's second floor, the air was much cooler. Without the braziers providing their constant heat, Scribe Hall was a cold tomb. He made another trip to the wall to replace the oil and picked up a flint. He walked back to the brazier, struck the flint until it caught the wick. Eager flame licked up from the black surface and illuminated the wall. Welcome heat radiated outward. Herodotus reached his desk and lit his lamp. A small, narrow scroll sat on his table. Herodotus frowned. Instead of the library's official bronze rollers, he could see the ends were made of cedar. He picked up the scroll and examined the rollers. There was no seal or stamp. Wherever the scroll had come from, it wasn't the library. He sat down and unrolled it. "Ah," he said as he saw the first words. "Transcribed by Titus Cleopas." The Babylonian scroll the head librarian had spoken of. Herodotus smiled at the lettering. Cleopas may be very knowledgeable, but his penmanship left much to be desired. Even Cleopas' signature was muddy and malformed. He began to read. The soldier Philus told the story of his friend Neretal, the man who led Alexander's scout regiment through the Indus Valley. After exile from the army, Neretal and his remaining men traveled through the Indus Valley in an attempt to make their way to Lothal. On their journey, they not only discovered a village of hostile people, but something that hunted them. Upon destroying the village populace, the scouts found a primitive temple of sorts. Philus could only say it was a hut from Neretal's description. Inside the makeshift temple, they discovered a book made of animal hide. The language inside the book was impossible to decipher. It was after discovering the book that they became hunted by the creature. Philus's descriptions of the monster were vague. The man admitted that he had written the account upon Neretal's passing, and as such was then able to get more details from his friend. Neretal, it seemed, had perished on the return journey to Babylon. A woman with crimson eyes that hunted, followed, killed. A deadly naiade, Herodotus muttered, that whispered to your loins until you wanted to follow her, couple with her. But her embrace was death to us all. A quote? Herodotus wondered. The book is the most beautiful and frightening thing I have ever seen, Philus had written. Every other page is an Indus, while the facing page is written in symbols I've never before seen. The words seem to glow as if drawn in human blood that still radiates stolen life. The final symbol in the book is the sigil Neretal describes seeing on the backs of the villagers. What strange religion did my friend uncover? I have placed the book in Alexander's treasure room. Since Nerital's death, it has haunted my dreams. I never wish to see the cursed thing again. As he neared the end of the tale, Gooseflesh broke out on his arms. Nerital had been no more than 5 days from Lothal, traveling down the banks of a green river, when he and his men discovered the village. Gucharateen, he whispered to the room. Certainly not. An enormous amount of time had passed since Akkad had fallen, more than a millennia. Triani described no such religion or customs, and certainly not a book. His people were incapable of marking more than years on a stone slab. Herodot rolled up the scroll, tied a ribbon around it, and then placed it in the pouch on his belt. He could leave it on the table, but it was Cleotus's. The man would no doubt want it returned. I have placed the book in Alexander's treasure room, he whispered to himself. Indus script, Philus had said. Herodot needed to find Cleotus after the Sabbath ceremony and ask him if he had seen the book. Herodot looked out the window. The sun hung high over the horizon. More time had passed than he thought. He rose from the table and walked to the end of the hall. He had just enough time to translate another of Triani's tablets. The hallway leading to the storeroom was pitch black. The torches and braziers had all gone dark. But the centurion... Hello? Herodot called down the hall. No response. Centurion! Nothing answered but an echo. A prickle of gooseflesh rose on his arms. The darkness was absolute, a waiting, yawning mouth. Filthy Jew! Herodot shuddered. The dark place. The boys. He turned back to Scribe Hall and headed for his table. The lamp. It wouldn't completely dispel the darkness, but it would be enough. With the lamp in his left hand, he walked back to the storeroom hallway. Slow steps. He moved forward into the darkness, listening to the blood pounding in his ears. Hello? He yelled down the passage. Nothing. Filthy Jew! The boys. Always the boys. Whenever darkness crept in, the voices were there. His muscles tightened as if he were still trapped in the cramped space. His breathing came in gasps with each step. Shaking with fear, Herodot made it to the corner. He turned and faced the dark storeroom. Centurion? He whispered. The artifact room echoed with his words. He turned to the brazier on the wall and dipped the lamp. A warm orange glow grew within the iron. The shadows slowly departed as the flames rose. The pounding in his chest slowed. Nothing. The centurion was gone. The grate was still in place. With a sigh, Herodot walked to the tablet shelves. He placed the lamp on the stone floor and knelt on his haunches. He searched the edges of the tablets, taking note of which had dust and which did not. Clean, clean, clean. Ah! He pulled 2 tablets from the shelf. He knew it was ambitious, but maybe he had enough time to get through both. A bird screeched from inside the grate. Herodot stiffened, but didn't cry out. Shaking his head, he rose with the lamp and tablets and walked from the room.